Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Dark Diaries. All right, I don't even know how many hours I've been doing this of trying to film different cases and trying to find different ones that are interesting to me that I feel like I can go on and on and on about because every single case that I've gone over, like 3 different ones, it only lasts like 30 minutes. So I wanted it to be a little bit longer, but honestly, without being a licensed professional psychologist, it's really hard to elaborate on most of the information psychologically. So that way, it does last longer. And I don't want to be one of those people that just regurgitates true crime stories to you guys because you can get that anywhere, right? As a forensic psychology student, I'm mostly interested in the psychological facts, as I'm sure you guys are too. But with that being said, I do need to make a disclaimer before I go on about this case. I am a forensic psychology student. I'm not a licensed professional. I am not a psychologist. I am not any way, shape, or form a person that you should be taking professional advice, especially psychologically from, okay? As of yet, until I get my degree. One of the people that I was going to talk about today was Ed Gein, but I feel like we can push him to another day because everybody knows about Ed Gein for the most part, but he is one of the most interesting people to me to study because of what he did and just like grave robbing and stuff, but everybody knows about him. So I checked that off. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe I should talk about the Twinkie defense, which is a case about this guy who murdered 2 people and then was like, oh, well, I murdered them because I eat a lot of junk food and it caused my depression and my depression caused me to murder. But I was like, I went on that case and it was like 30 minutes long. I'm like, okay, I need something else. I want something with a little more to it, right? A little more za. This one is messed up. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you are a person that gets queasy or really doesn't want to hear something extremely gruesome, just turn off the pod now because I'm going to tell you right now, I would get a snack, but I eat it fast before you start listening to this. And for the record, I am going to read off of my notes on the computer because I don't want to miss any facts at all, and I want to be able to get as much information in as I can. With that being said, let's get into the Cannibal Cop case. Okay, so we got this guy. He's named Gilberto Valle. I don't really know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but whatevs. So Gilberto was a New York City police officer who in 2012, he became infamous after being arrested for planning to kidnap, torture, and eat women. Hence, the cannibalism. Valle was a 28-year-old officer with the NYPD at the time of his arrest. He was married and had a young child. Of course he did. He had access to sensitive information through his police work, including private data on potential victims, which made the case even more chilling. Valle's online activities were the focus of the investigation, and he was using online forums and chat rooms to discuss his fantasies of kidnapping, torturing, and eating women. The case began when Valle's wife discovered disturbing images on his computer where he was talking to people about wanting to eat women and his fantasies for kidnapping women and just committing horrible, horrible acts on them. So like a good person, his wife contacted the authorities, which led into an investigation on him. In his computer and online chats, Valle had detailed plans for abducting women, some of whom were acquaintances, and carrying out the fantasy of cooking and eating them. The police investigation found that Valle had access to a database of personal information, which included the names, addresses, and photos of women he was obsessed with. He was arrested in 2012 after the FBI traced his online communications, and they found that the messages in which he had made explicit references to cooking and eating women as well as plotting to kidnap them. However, Valle actually hadn't carried out any of these plans, and there weren't actual victims, and the women he had spoken about were actually never harmed. Despite this, Valle was charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, abduction, and an illegal use of police databases for the purposes of planning his crimes, which, duh, you can't do that. People in the police department can't even, look up someone's name. So, let's say I'm Caitlyn and I work for a police department and I want to see if Joe Schmo got arrested. I can't just look up Joe Schmo for no reason just because I want to know something. So, already that there is a illegal maneuver. Valle's case is often examined from a psychological standpoint, especially regarding his sexual fantasies and paraphilia. He seemed to be motivated by a specific kind of fantasy related to cannibalism and sexual violence known as vor. It's a fetish involving fantasies about eating or being eaten. There's another case, too, where a guy got on Craigslist and he said, hey, I have a fantasy of eating people. And is anyone going to be my, volunteer? And there was a guy that actually hit him back up and was like, yo, I want to be eaten. I will come to your house and you can eat me. And he did. That's vor. That's crazy. So going on, Forensic psychologists would likely diagnose him with paraphilic disorder, given his persistent sexual interest in cannibalism and his torture. His obsession with eating women was a key part of the case, obviously. And then this goes into a fantasy versus reality type scenario. So Valley's defense argued that his actions were simply fantasies and that there was no actual intention to harm anyone. However, forensic psychologists examine whether fantasies of this nature are indicative of psychopathy, sexual sadism, or other severe personality disorders. With this being said, and actually no one being harmed, who's that celebrity that was talking about that? Wasn't he like, God, I forget his name. He was talking to women and he was like divulging in the information that he had like sexual fantasies of like eating women as well. So AKA the vor, and like biting women. Like he was doing weird stuff like that. I forget his name, but he was really, really famous at one point, and then he kind of like fell off. If you remember, let me know in the comments because I'm blanking. But going on, Valley's ability to separate fantasy from reality while maintaining a normal life on the surface raised questions about his capacity for empathy, emotional regulation, and moral judgment. So I'm going to assume that he had some sort of narcissistic ability or tendencies, or antisocial personality disorder, which is, a big thing that I always talk about, especially with the lack of empathy. It's kind of raising the alarm for that, but we're going to see. During the trial, Valley's defense argued that the conversations and plans were simply fantasies, that he had never any intention to act on them. They also pointed out that Valley had no criminal record and appeared to be stable, functioning member of society. Okay. Even though he was a New York City cop and stuff, if someone is messaging other people and they're like, hey, I kind of want to eat you and I just want to dabble into cannibalism a little bit, I'm pretty sure that doesn't mean that they're stable. But go off, sis. Prosecution, however, argued that the nature of Valley's fantasy suggested a high likelihood of acting on them. Duh. They pointed out the fact that Valley had used his position as a police officer to gather information about his targets and has gone as far as to make detailed plans. Pretty sure that means he's not stable, y'all, but to each their own. Valley was convicted in 2013, but the case went through multiple appeals. That's wild. How are you going to go through multiple appeals when he's literally talking about cannibalism? Like, I understand there's not a victim yet, but how can you also at the same time say there's not a victim when he preyed upon people? He just didn't actually physically hurt them yet. That still doesn't really correlate them to not be a victim. You know what I mean? Like, in which way, shape, or form would you still not be a victim, whether you're aware of something or not? If someone has the information on you and literally took all of your information, your address, your name, everything, how can you not be a victim of that? Question mark, question mark. The second trial ended with a reversal of his conviction for conspiracy to kidnap. Valley had been sentenced to 2 years in prison, but his case remains controversial due to the question of whether his thoughts and fantasies should have led to criminal charges without any actual harm taking place. I don't know why this would be controversial, because literally what? What do you mean? What do you mean without any actual harm taking place? I understand that, but if someone's a cannibal just because they didn't actually physically hurt someone and didn't eat them, how is that still not harming a person? Like, me personally, if I found out someone had my name, address, and whatever, the emotional and like psychological damage that would do to me, even if they were in prison, knowing that someone wanted to murder me and eat me, still would probably make me a victim. No? Like, okay, let's just bop off here. Valley's case brings up the intersection between sexual paraphilia, sadism, and criminal behavior. His fantasies about abducting, torturing, and eating women are consistent with the diagnostic criteria for sexual sadism disorder, where an individual derives sexual pleasure from inflicting harm or humiliation on others. That's a weird one. We haven't gotten on that in school yet for forensic psych, but I feel as though sexual sadism and sexual disorders in general are going to be something that I really want to look at, because it's so common, not only in the United States, just in the world in general. Like, when people compulsively rape or people compulsively commit sexual abuse on others, like, why is that? Or like some of the things that they do, it's just crazy. Like, who is liking to commit cannibalism for sexual acts? Like, it's just interesting to me. It's different, obviously. From a forensic psychology standpoint, Valle may have engaged in moral disengagement, which is the psychological mechanism where individuals justify or downplay their harmful behaviors. You also kind of see this in narcissism when people are like, oh, that didn't really happen, or they like really start to distort your reality and like downplay everything because they know that they're wrong. It's kind of like that. In Valle's case, though, his ability to separate fantasy from reality and compartmentalize his life would be a focal point for the forensics analysis, like for the forensic psychologist. Forensic psychologists would likely examine whether Valle exhibits traits of psychopathy, particularly as a lack of empathy and an inclination to act without regard for the harm of others, meaning he didn't care how it affects other people. Most of the time, the lack of empathy and the acting without regard for the harm of others goes hand in hand, not all the time, but most of the time. Valle's apparent lack of remorse and his ability to plan and fantasize about these acts without taking any real action makes him a case of interest in psychological studies of psychopathy. Despite being convicted, Valle's case remains an important study in forensic psychology, particularly in how fantasies, the internet, and access to personal information can fuel dangerous thoughts without actual criminal activity taking place. Valle's release after his conviction was reversed, raising the question of whether individuals like him can truly be rehabilitated, especially when their fantasies are deeply ingrained and form a key part of their identity. Okay, so that's all the notes, and I know it's like really fast and whatnot, but let's talk about it. I want to get more so into the psychological analysis of things because you guys know the crime. He didn't actually really hurt anyone, but still like the behaviors behind it is like, what the heck? And that's what I want to talk about with forensic psych because why else would I be studying it? Paraphilia and sexual fetishism is described in this case, and paraphilia is defined as an intense, atypical sexual interest, which are necessary for sexual gratification. In this case, Valle's behaviors fit into the category of sexual cannibalism, which is a rare form of paraphilia. There's honestly not a lot of cases that I know of that people are really into cannibalism. So when you hear about it, especially with a New York City cop, I'm pretty sure that's going to make headlines. Forensic psychologists would identify Valle as having sexual sadism disorder and cannibalism fetishism known as VOR, which we talked about earlier, which involves sexual fantasies about eating or being eaten. Again, going back to the other case from like the Craigslist guy, I don't know who would be offering themselves up to be eaten or where that comes from, like for a person to want to be eaten. But in my personal opinion, this is something that I haven't learned yet, but in my personal opinion, I think it's kind of like one of those things where it's like Jeffrey Dahmer, when he started eating people, he's like, I just love them so much. I want to be loved. Like they're with me always. Maybe it's kind of something like that. And it just turns into a sexual fantasy somehow because they want to be loved. I don't know. But cannibalism is weird to me because it's just like, okay, you want that person with you and you're wanting love, but like in such a messed up way, you know? Valle's involvement in online forums that catered to these extreme fetishes Valle's involvement in online forums that catered to these extreme fetishes suggests a sexual preference for sadistic activities, which include not only domination, but also violent, humiliating acts like torture and cannibalism. Fantasies are central to the case, which his attorneys argued that Valle's actions didn't constitute a criminal conspiracy because they remained fantasies. I still disagree with that, but we already know how court is and what lawyers are going to say to get their clients off. But from a forensic psychology perspective, his fantasies reflected a deeper pathology, particularly the preoccupation with violence and cannibalism. Valle displayed signs of psychopathy, such as emotional detachment, lack of remorse, and persistent obsession with violent fantasies. Psychopaths typically lack empathy, and obviously Valle did in this case as well. And he also had a willingness to discuss violently abusing women online without concern for their well-being, which obviously fits within the psychopathic tendencies. His ability to rationalize and fantasize about his violent acts without any regard for the harm that they would cause points to his inability to empathize with the victims that he talked about. Not only this, but psychopaths also demonstrate moral disengagement, which is the ability to separate themselves from the consequences of their actions by rationalizing or minimizing the harm they cause to others. Valle's detachment from his fantasies and the fact that he could continue to work as a police officer during this just goes to show his lack of remorse and the idea that he can have a psychological phenomenon going on right now. But the case also raises huge concerns between the line of fantasy and reality. Forensic psychologists often struggle with cases like this where a person hasn't actually committed a violent act against a person, but rather has shown like very violent tendencies because it shows a deep preoccupation within that person. Valley's detailed plans were clearly not hypothetical, but were tied to a personal fantasy. And psychologists went on to note that they would ask whether the intensity of Valley's obsession was a risk factor for eventual action. His detailed nature and use of professional resources like the police databases indicated a higher likelihood of transition from fantasy to reality, because why else would he be looking at that stuff if it was just a fantasy? Like, if it's just a fantasy, he probably wouldn't even looked at that stuff. And even if it was just a fantasy, like, you still should probably get checked out, because I don't think that's normal to just think about cannibalism like that. Valley's defense argued that his actions were not criminal because they remained in the realm of fantasy and were not physically enacted. This case and his argument brings up the question of moral responsibility and free will in forensic psychology. From a psychological perspective, while Valley's plans were never realized, his ability to access personal information and his extreme fixation on violent fantasies raised questions about his control over impulses and whether his fantasies could have been manifested into criminal acts in the future. I'm surprised I didn't go for the insanity defense, because when you get into the control over impulses, like, one of the big things for insanity defense is that you legit cannot control yourself. The prosecution argued that even though no crime had been committed, Valley's behavior warranted criminal charges because he had planned and plotted violent acts against women. He accessed private information through his position as a police officer and used these resources to further his fantasies. Valley's defense argued that there was no intent to act on the plans, and therefore, again, it was just a fantasy and it's nothing criminal. They contended that Valley's behavior was protected under free speech and that fantasies alone should not be criminalized. Valley was convicted in 2013 for kidnapping conspiracy, but his conviction was later overturned on an appeal in 2014. He was released after serving a short period in prison, but his case raised serious questions about the limits of criminal liability for violent fantasies. So the aftermath of everything was that Valley's case remains a key example in the discussion of how fantasies intersect with criminal law and psychological pathology. The question of whether he should have been convicted purely for his thoughts has sparked debate among legal scholars and psychologists. Valley's case also highlights the role of technology in online communities in fostering dangerous fantasies. His involvement in online forums dedicated to extreme paraphilia allowed his thoughts to be normalized and amplified. I believe now, maybe it's on the dark web, but I think there are like cannibal sites from what I've heard, and it might be from the other cases that have come up, but I never would have thought in a million years that cannibalism like sites were a thing, but trust me, it is. Despite his release, many continue to question whether Valley remains a danger to society, and forensic psychologists would likely be cautious in considering his mental state, as his violent fantasies were never fully extinguished. Cases like this are what makes me interested in forensic psych, because it's like, how does one become so interested in cannibalism that they just start looking it up? Like, honestly, until Green Inferno, years and years and years ago of watching it, I wouldn't even known what cannibalism was, or maybe like until learning about Jeffrey Dahmer or something. Like, who just gets the thought of like, I think I could really bite your finger off. I think I could really take a bite of that skin. Like, huh? And what does that come from? There's a lot of questions that I have about it. Bailey Sarian is one of those people too that is extremely interested in cannibalism, and I can't say that I've been one of those people that have been like super, super interested in it. But after learning about this case, it has me questioning a lot more. First of all, how could you even argue that that's not a crime? And I can understand that there wasn't a victim, but at the same time, like, the people that he searched up, I'm telling you, like, psychologically, I would be messed up from that. I would never trust anyone. I would think that everyone's trying to hurt me, eat me, murder me. What was his childhood like? Was he abused? Like, does cannibalism, is it genetic? Is it just environmental? Or is it just like spring on you? Like, how does that come about? I have questions, a lot of questions. And this is what makes me excited to keep learning about forensic psychology. I know it's messed up. I'm only in my third semester, and it's like, God, I have all these questions and I just want to know more about it, but I don't know enough information yet to tell you guys. The messed up cases like this bring out more and more questions in me that I just want answered. And as time goes on, we're going to be able to get those answers within my schooling. But until then, you guys just got to hear the stories like this, and we got to collaborate together to figure out the answers. Where does cannibalism come from? Obviously, it's been years. People have been doing it for years and years and years. I mean, again, I'm going to reference The Green Inferno. That was a very eye-opening movie. But how does that come about in one person? Like Jeffrey Dahmer, I know when he had it, it was like he was taking apart animals, and at just one point he was like, I just keep looking at it. I just, oh, let me get a little nibble. Where does the curiosity come from? Like, I know you have a lack of empathy, is what they're saying in the case. But even then, like, you're not grossed out. You're not like, ew, I shouldn't do this. Ew. You're like, that looked like a roast beef that I want to eat. Grody. But I want to know more about it. Like, if I could sit in a class and one of my professors be like, okay, today's class is on cannibalism. We're just going to do a deep dive. Dude, I'm sat. Just like Bailey Sarian, I'm sat. I want to hear about it. I want to know everything because what? How does cannibalism come about? Are you born with it? Is it a learned behavior? Is it just curiosity? How does it turn into sexual sadism? How does it turn into a fantasy? Why do people want to be eaten? Guys, there's a lot of questions. I know this isn't a long episode, but hopefully someday in one of my semesters we talk about cannibalism so I can come back to this video and let you guys know more. But I hope you guys enjoyed today's weird, messed up episode. And don't get eaten today, okay? I love you. I'll see you next episode. Bye, y'all.